Hello, I'm Kelly Hill, reporter for RCR Wireless News. Welcome to our webinar on the Smarter Telco, Exploring Service and Network Intelligence. I'm joined today by Patrick Kelly, Research Director for Analysys Mason's Telecoms Software Research Team. We'll be talking about the service aspects of the customer experience and how that plays into customer retention. Understanding and measuring customers' perceptions of a company and its products or services is difficult because there are many touch points in the life cycle of a customer relationship. It begins with the customer inquiring about a service, followed by joining, then onboarding, servicing, and finally the renewal process. Each step involves different interactions with employees and the service required to either satisfy or impress the customer. Our webinar today is sponsored by F5 Networks. Next slide, please. These are our participants today. Next slide, please. And these are some of the takeaways from our report that's being released this week at rcrwireless.com. Big data is increasingly being integrated into wireless operations as operators seek to reduce CapEx and OpEx and reduce churn by relying on intelligence to shape business decisions. There are a variety of methods for gathering network-based and customer service-based information on the customer experience. Data alone isn't enough. It needs to be processed into actionable intelligence. And again, today we're going to be focused on the customer service-based information for the customer experience and how that plays into reducing churn. Next slide, please. And now let's get into the topic. Patrick, let's start off with your presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Kelly, and thanks for the invitation to present some material in and around the area of customer experience management, which is where the focus is going to be on this material that I have today. And I want to talk about a framework for driving customer loyalty, because for me, when you look at most of the service providers that are focused in and around customer experience management, the primary objective for communication service providers in and around this area is to improve customer loyalty. So there's a number of things I'm going to talk about today, and then we'll get into a Q&A session. So I've got about 10 to 15 minutes of material here. So we can move to the next slide. So I just want to baseline the market, and again, I'm with Analysys Mason. We're a global market research company, and we focus exclusively on the communication service provider marketplace. And so, I want to start just by talking about, what does the business environment look like today within the telecommunications market, and how does this ultimately drive investments, if you will, in improving the customer experience. So a couple of view graphs here. The one on the left really focuses on traffic from mobile connections. So most service providers are focusing on a lot of their growth business, and mobile data services is a huge area for growth with both incumbent operators and new entrants in the marketplace. So this particular graph shows worldwide traffic from mobile connections based on research that we've published. And then the two other lines in the graph show traffic in developed markets and emerging markets. The view graph or the chart on the right looks at different businesses. So one of the things we look at is whether you're selling directly to consumers or businesses, what drives the overall objectives around where investments get placed may vary slightly based on the business unit. So there's certain lines of business, and this segmentation that you see is the overall market. So we're really looking at a market of $2 trillion annually in revenue around voice, data, video, PSDN, and business type services. And I've segmented it based on forecast data that we've collected in the marketplace. And so the key point here really is, as service providers focus on their individual customers, so whether it be business customers or consumers in the case of residential broadband or mobile services, they're looking at different ways in which they can impart change on their business and then utilize various systems that give them the information that they need to adjust and ultimately improve that service. So if we look at the next slide that I have, customer satisfaction between consumers and their provider, communication service provider, really is looking at different interactions between the customer and the service provider over a certain period of time, and that could be months or even years. And so when we kind of see this marketplace and what's happening, we have different there's different business objectives. The service providers being pressured, where margins from some of the core cash cow services like voice are in decline, and there's pressure there. We're looking at threats from over-the-top providers like Apple and Google and other social media type firms that are riding, their services are riding over the infrastructure of the communication service provider, and yet that information or data that's transiting network is not necessarily being monetized in terms of the capital investments being made by the communication service provider. And then you have other things with respect to the customer, which is things around who owns the customer. Is it Facebook? Is it Apple? Or is it the relationship you have if you're an individual here in the United States? Is it with AT&T Wireless or Verizon Wireless, or for that matter, any other communication service provider offering mobile services in that example? So who owns the customer, and what level of support can be provided? And so many of the problems that service providers are faced with is this ecosystem, if you will, is getting much more complicated. It's not just simply providing a well-defined set of services. A lot of these application-type services are being provided by other companies. When you get into cloud computing, you have different partners and different suppliers in that ecosystem, and it's really determining the type of relationship and responsibility that you have to the customer when things don't work, or if it's an interaction on a particular service was ordered but was not necessarily delivered, in the case of say video on demand, for example. So if we move to the next slide, one of the things I want to talk about is customer loyalty, and when we look at customer loyalty, for us, it's really driven by our own experiences, or it may be influenced by family and friends. And one of the things that gets a metric that's used not only in the telecommunications industry but in other industries as well is the Net Promoter Score, which is a metric really that has been standardized since earlier this decade around measuring customer loyalty. So it was a concept developed by Bain back in 2003, and it uses a simple scale of -100 to +100 to measure either detractors or promoters. So you might say, well, what do the values mean? Well, a score of +50 would be excellent, just to put it in context. And essentially, it's based off of a 11-point scale, and using this scale rating with consumers, it gives companies a way to look at products and services, but also how their brand's performing in the marketplace. So the chart that I have in front of you is an indicator of how well Apple's doing in the marketplace based on consumers that they're selling to. Um, Apple has a score of plus 72. If you look at the bottom of the chart, Verizon Internet scores a plus 13, and this is based on polls conducted last year. So it gives you a sense for how different companies get viewed based on how consumers are rating them using an NPS value. And some of that's not just based purely on the interaction. As I said, it could be influencers, which could be family or friends. So let's move to the next slide. What I want to talk about a little bit is, from a communication service provider's perspective, is the customer lifecycle journey. So what does that look like? And it typically starts with some sort of evaluation. So you as an individual, if you're considering a service, there's a process that you'll go through. It could be looking online. It could be window shopping. It could be talking to family and friends. It could be going into a retail store. But at some point, there's an evaluation process that goes on, which in fact is one interaction that you're going to have with potentially a business, or in this case, a communication service provider that ultimately you may end up giving your business to. The next part of that journey, if you will, in a relationship would be what I'm calling the join phase, which is once you've made that decision and you've decided to join or buy a particular service. In some cases, it can be over a 1 year or 2 year contract type period, and it involves things like if you're buying broadband services, a technician visiting the home, perhaps going to a store and activating the mobile phone, or some sort of self-service function. The third area, which is onboarding, would be where the service actually gets set up. You're setting up payment. There's some level of training, how to use the service. That's the onboarding process. And the fourth phase of the relationship is support, which is it involves things like if there's a problem with the service that you're using, how do you get the support that you need? And again, one of the things that's interesting in this market is if you look at different socioeconomic classes or different demographic classes, there's a preference. A younger crowd is going to prefer to do things online rather than call into a call center. So you have different support channels, if you will, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later, which could be web chat. It could be crowdsourcing through online communities. It could be picking up the phone and talking to a call center agent. Those are all interactions that are important for communication service provider to measure, and they give them another data point, if you will, on how well the customer perceives them and their products and services in the marketplace. This last area, the renew area, is the final phase, which is a decision process that's made on whether or not you continue to do business. Perhaps there's some sort of promotional offer that's provided to keep you on board as a customer. In any case, there's a decision point whether you stay with a particular service provider or not, which is measured by most communication service providers, and you see this in their financial reports as a churn metric. So their ability to actually retain existing customers that they have, and again, it's an important metric, both financially as well as the success, if you will, of a service provider, because there's financial implications. There's a cost in terms of acquiring new customers. So it's a metric that does get measured. So if we move to the next slide, I want to give you just kind of set the stage, if you will, and just a few areas that we've looked at when I talk about channels of communication. So this particular graph looks at a couple things. One is, the number of transactions coming into a particular operator. And again, I'm showing different metrics. So some of it may be through the CSR via phone call, it could be a text chat, an email, or something straightforward like web self-service, which is very inexpensive relative to some of the other channels of communication. So there's two things going on within the industry. One is a drive for lowering the cost to support each customer. So that's obviously a business driver. But the other important thing is automating and improving different channels of communication between the customer and the service provider. And what we're seeing is a big push towards self-care, because not only is it a lower cost transaction, but it's also in many cases a preferred mode by the customer to get the information they need from a service provider. And the last slide that I have here before we kind of go into a Q&A discussion is looking at sort of the different communication channels and how the systems play in to support these customers. So as I mentioned before, channels of communication can be interactive voice recognition, self-care, a basic web portal, a live agent, text chat, any one of those mechanisms. But there's a whole set of systems that are that exist in the operations environment where that information is processed and categorized. So some of it may be as mundane as a billing dispute, or could be related to poor performance of the network. It could be related to failure of a particular device, a lost handset. So there's a number of different things that go on where as information or communication occurs between the customer and the service provider, they need to be able to classify it, prioritize it, and address that information. And it's the systems that are in place to measure how well, in this case, those types of inquiries are handled, and again, the level of satisfaction between the customer and the communication service provider. So, I mean, this is on a grand scale too. I mean, we've talked to some communication service providers that are handling 45, 50, 60 million calls or transactions. Well, I should say calls per year. So if you can imagine handling 60 million calls per year, and you kind of move to some of the other channels of communication that are more self-service web-based, you're getting into hundreds, perhaps several hundred millions of transactions going on over the course of a year. And this is where Kelly had mentioned sort of big data and analytics, and it's an area that we sort of see as important for service providers to improve the customer experience, but also to gain further intel in the things that their customers want, how they're actually treated in this whole support cycle, and also as a predictive element on the ability to actually predict churn. And there's things that you can do beyond what I'm talking about that looks at more structured data, which is either calls coming in or transactions through the web. You can even use unstructured data, which provides intel that might be social media sites that indicate the level of satisfaction between a customer and their service provider. And these are techniques that are being used in the industry to both improve customer retention and loyalty, but also as a way to drive revenue and be more targeted at the types of products and services that are getting launched that might be of interest to a particular consumer. So that's sort of, I guess, a level set at this point. And there's a lot more information that I could talk to you about and share, but I think at this point for the webinar, we're going to we're going to jump right into a Q&A session. Kelly?
Yes, and we'd like to encourage our audience members, please use the interface to submit any questions that you have. Patrick, I'm going to start off with a question for you that kind of, takes a step back and asks a very broad definition of, of what is customer experience management.
Yeah, so when I look at customer experience management, it's the ability to assess, measure, and understand how well, how the customer views, in this case, the communication service provider, and so it's really a process, if you will, to ascertain. And again, there's some of the systems that I talked about. There's ways in which you can measure satisfaction through interactions or the level of the quality of service that's being delivered to that customer. But then there's also other methods that can be used, which I haven't talked about, which is surveying. And we do know that service providers will go in on a recurring basis and survey their customers about their perception of the products and services and just the company as a whole and their interaction with the employees within the company. So customer experience management really is the ability to assess and measure the customer's experience and then hopefully to improve on that with the systems and the processes that have been put in place.
Okay, can you talk about the factors that are driving the market for investments in customer experience management?
Yeah, there's, I think there's a few of them that I talked about, and I'll just recap and maybe some things that I haven't really talked about. So, one of the key drivers, and I'll put this in the context of, ultimately what's the business outcome. So when we kind of look at investments, really service providers have acknowledged, okay, this is an area that's of importance to them, and they're looking for some sort of business outcome. So, just to recap, one of the things I talked about is reducing the cost of support. And what that means is, from an investment cycle, offering customers different ways to interact with the communication service provider. One of these ways is through a self-service portal in terms of a channel of communication. So the ability to actually implement multiple channels of interaction and self-service is a big area of investment right now in the marketplace. The other thing is improving quality of service and doing it rapidly. So, another area that we see in terms of business goals with communication service providers is getting it right the first time. So what this means for service providers is they want to not only articulate the offer clearly, but they want to fulfill the order once and solve any problems, hopefully in one call. That's not always possible, but it's a goal. So that's where we see another area of investment. And then, the other thing that I obviously talked about quite a bit was keeping customers. So, if you use a metrics, and again, a very high-level metric like NPS, if you have a high NPS, in some ways there's a correlation to lower churn rates. So the ability to actually, for service providers to measure Net Promoter Score, employee Net Promoter Score, and look at customer effort scores and surveying is other areas in which we're seeing investments occur in the marketplace.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about the techniques that they're using that can be used to improve Net Promoter Score?
Yeah, well, a technique would be one of the most straightforward technique would be surveying. But I think the other techniques that we see occurring in the marketplace is, again, kind of going back to big data and analytics, is looking at data coming up from the network. So there's a lot of data that comes up from the network that is useful not only in the operations center but also useful in customer call centers that can be utilized where information is put in front of call center agents that provides them with not only information on the customer and the service, but how well that service was performing, and perhaps if there were disruptions and such with a particular service or a server outage occurring or something related to technology. It could be denial of service or IP address allocation. That information is actually put in front of the call center agent, and a lot of the information is consolidated. So that's another technique where you can utilize different sets of information that are already available within the service provider's environment and expose that capability to first-level support, in this case, customer call center agents that avoid escalation and help improve first call resolution, or what I call getting it right the first time.
You talked, and we talked in general a lot about things that are aimed at reducing churn and reducing costs associated with churn. I'm wondering what your view is on additional revenue opportunities that might be available for operators in terms of really using some of this information that they have about the customer experience.
Yeah. So one of the I guess one of the techniques would be looking at influencers, and I talked about this whole concept around social networking. So there's usually influencers that what service providers are looking at, and this kind of goes back to churn, but also ultimately has an impact on revenue and profitability. If you can harvest data, and again, looking at customer behavior, patterns of network usage, you can start to predict the propensity to churn for some subscribers. So one of the things that we've seen being utilized, in terms of big data and analytics, is pruning down a smaller set of the customer base that has a higher probability to churn, and then actually getting to those customers before they leave the operator. And we've seen a number of use cases where this is done on a regular basis and proactively to help improve those loyalty metrics and reduce the churn rates.
Mm-hmm. Are there any other use cases that we haven't touched on at this point that you think are relevant to service providers really having success with this?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you another example. I mean, and again, I think, it's the ability of service providers to work in partnership with some of their key suppliers and glean out some of the information that would be useful to them. But there's there's one example in Europe where a scenario in which the latest iPhone came out, and that iPhone was passed down to a spouse or other family member, and one of the things that and this is sort of a revenue generation play, is one of the things that was picked up was that for those phones that were passed along, there wasn't the same sort of usage that you would expect from other users on the network, and so there was an attempt to understand, like, why did this behavior exist, but then also a marketing initiative to target and promote a particular campaign to those specific users, which resulted in very high conversion rate on data plans, where data plans didn't exist before because it was just simply being used as a basic basic phone for voice primarily, and so that would be a case of where you're looking at specific events going on. In this case, an upgrade to or a new launch of the iPhone 5, and then trying to understand patterns and behavior and usage trends. And in this case, targeting a subset of the subscriber base to get a conversion on data plans that ultimately ended up generating revenue for this particular operator, based on that information that they had in and around network usage and matching it to other customer patterns and behaviors.
Okay. I have one last question, and that is, how does customer experience management play out differently for enterprise customers versus consumers? We've talked a lot about this, I think, mostly from the consumer perspective, and I'm wondering how you see operators using this kind of information to really better serve their enterprise customers as well.
Yeah, well, one of the areas that in the business market that we've identified as a high growth area is in the small and medium enterprise market for cloud services, particularly with mobile users. So in that case, it's the ability to understand the underlying technology. So in a cloud-based offer, whether it be infrastructure or software as a service, it's tying together the different technology domains and assuring overall end-to-end quality of service to both guarantee the end-to-end quality of that service, so providing very watertight SLAs, but also to target, in this case, a specific area of growth, which is, if you look at cloud computing overall, most of the activity that we've seen is pretty much a private, and to some extent a hybrid cloud. This is a big push. We're seeing a big push now in the small and medium enterprise market where they want to gain sort of the same economies of scale, if you will, and elasticity that's offered to bigger enterprises, but they're also looking for the end-to-end quality of service, which again ties back to this measurement around ensuring the overall satisfaction for this particular class of enterprise customer. And so I think what we're seeing in the marketplace is you have different, particularly here in the United States, you have cable operators targeting that market, and you have other incumbent operators that are now selectively targeting that market opportunity for growth. And with that, they're going to have to have the capability, if you will, to provide an end-to-end measurement on something as complex as cloud computing and the infrastructure and all the software and platform services that would be utilized as well.
Okay, great. Well, audience members, if you have any questions, this is your last shot to get them in. We're going to be wrapping up here shortly, and today we've been joined by Patrick Kelly. He's the research director for Analysys Mason's telecom software research team. We'll be revisiting a similar topic with more focus on analytics with Patrick next week during our RCR TV webcast for our Smarter Telco. You can download the report from rcrwireless.com this week. And it doesn't look like we have any other questions. So, Patrick, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Kelly.
And we will talk some more on this topic next week. Thank you so much.